as we come along. Um, Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to today's session in our series of companies going remote. Different face than usual today. My name is Laura Hanlon and I am one of the many volunteers behind the Grow Remote organisation, which is a social enterprise whose mission is to enable people to work, live and participate locally. We do that by making remote work visible and accessible. We pool together all our information and resources that you need to help individuals realise the potential of remote and access that information, as well as helping companies to explore the avenue and possibilities of remote. As part of that, we have this series to help inform companies as they cope with COVID and hopefully help them to implement remote work longer term. Just to explain how the session will work, there's a Q&A box down at the bottom, so ask as many questions and as often as you would like throughout the session, and Dee will answer at the very end. To introduce Dee Coakley is super experienced in remote teams. When she's not in the room, she is known as the best operations person in Ireland. She led the operations for Accionista when they were going remote, and now she is the co-founder and CEO of Boundless, who do amazing work with helping people to employ people anywhere. Dee has helped Grow Remote on numerous occasions, but just to say, as a volunteer organisation, we never take your time for granted. So Dee, thank you so much for being here with us today. And on that, I'll let you take it over.
Thanks so much, Laura. And good to be here. Always really happy to do anything with Grow Remote. I love what Grow Remote is doing and achieving, and it's always brilliant to meet people involved and interested in the space. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and yeah, you might let me know if you're able to see that okay. Give me just a moment. Let's see. Oh, it's the wrong screen. Hold on just a second. So there we go. Hopefully everyone can see that okay.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So yeah, as Laura said, my name's Dee. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Boundless. And Boundless is a remote employment platform that allows companies to compliantly employ people internationally. I spent 10 years in COO roles with B2B software companies. And it was through those roles that I came to get involved in remote work. My earlier days in the tech sector in COO roles, remote work was far less common. It's become much more common over the last few years. And over that time, I felt the considerable challenges of managing employment for geographically distributed teams. And that led me to founding Boundless. So Boundless acts as an employer of record on behalf of our customers. And we take care of all of the admin and compliance headaches around international employment, payroll, tax, HR, all that very glamorous stuff. And this means that companies can get set up to employ someone in a new country within minutes, rather than it taking months, as it usually would when they go the DIY route. As Laura said, I've overseen and built remote teams for the last 6 years. In my case, they've been geographically distributed teams, but a lot of the same approaches apply. Once people are remote, it's irrelevant how far they are apart from each other. The same practices and approaches apply. At Boundless, we're a remote first company. So that means that we always had the intention of building a distributed team. We started the company a little over a year ago, and we defined all of our policies and documentation to make it appropriate for supporting a distributed team. And when we've hired, every role we've hired for, those people could have been based anywhere. To keep things easy, we do, we're very small business. We have 11 people right now. We'll be 20 at the end of this year. But to keep things straightforward, we do focus on Europe to keep people in similar time zones. But you know, we have no doubt that we'll spread our wings further than that over the longer run. Given the nature of our business, I talk with leaders of distributed companies every day. and we support those companies with defining the best possible remote work policies. So today I'm going to talk about policy and people ops for remote companies. So I'm sure none of you would disagree that people, whatever your business is, people are your biggest asset. And it's crucially important to be recruiting, hiring, and retaining the very best people if you want your business to succeed. And as we enter challenging times and choppy waters, that's more important than ever. Having the best people to make sure that your business succeeds through those challenging times is of huge importance. And of course, you know, Grow Remote's whole philosophy, which I firmly believe in, is that talent is distributed. The very best people for your business at the stage that your business is at any point in time are very unlikely to be clustered in one place. And you will find that once you broaden that net, I mean, I found it myself. I had in the past hired internationally for more technical roles and more specialist roles. For Boundless, all of the ops roles that we've hired for, we've opened them up to remote. Previously, I would have hired my ops team as a co-located team. And once I opened up to remote hiring, I've just been absolutely astounded at the quality of people that we're seeing. So I can definitely advocate for the best people being distributed.
Dee, sorry to jump in on you there just for a second. A few people are saying that the audio isn't really great. It kind of crackles every now and again.
Okay, give me just one moment. I'm going to switch to headphones. And that might
Perfect.
help.
Sorry about this now. Thank you everyone for calling that out.
So I do have some connectivity issues here, and that might be causing a problem. Could be my speaker. Just going to connect these, which will take just a second. I actually purchased a new headset today, and it arrived about 10 minutes before I came on this call, so I didn't have time to set it up. I was hoping it would be here this morning.
Always the way, isn't it?
I've had problems over the day. So let me just connect this with my screen share for just a moment.
No problem.
I'll just sort this out. Now, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Let's see. Can you hear me okay there?
Yeah, there's less of a crackle there. Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, sorry about that. So I'm going to share my screen again.
Perfect.
Thanks, Laura, for letting me know. So I'm not sure what people missed there. So not sure what people missed, but just to recap, people being the biggest asset, really keen to recruit, hire, and retain the very best people that you can find. Talent is absolutely distributed. It's very unlikely that if you want the very best people for your business at the stage that you're at, that they'll all be clustered in one location. And my own personal experience has been that once I opened up recruitment to locationless, hiring from anywhere, I've been absolutely flabbergasted and astounded at the quality of people that I've been able to hire, and also people with really specialist skills. It's a game changer once you start hiring remotely. So in order to find the best people, it's really important to develop a considered employer brand. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And implementing the right recruitment process is really important. If you haven't hired remote before, it can be a very new experience. So we'll touch on that. And then, of course, you'll want to educate yourself on remote work and local employment regulations. And it's really important to be implementing best practice remote work policies, and we can talk through some of those. So developing an employer brand. Getting the very best candidates into your recruitment pipeline and convincing them to come and work for you is about ensuring that you're perceived as a really awesome company to work for. And that perception that you create, hopefully it's very much about what your company genuinely represents. Candidates will see through it at the recruitment process if how you're representing yourself online or in job adverts is not really representative of the values of your company. But once you figure that out and figure those values out, that is how companies find the people that they need to succeed. And it's really important to remember that a great employer brand isn't about ping pong tables or great food or beer on tap. A lot of companies wonder how they can compete with the very, very large multinational employers who offer all of these extra perks, and they wonder how they'll compete with flashy offices. But these things are not how you win over great employees. And it's really important to remember that right now, nobody's using offices as their bait to attract the really great candidates. How you present yourself as a great employer and what your employer brand focuses on needs to evolve in this new world that we're living in, and needs to evolve if you're moving from co-located to remote. And research always shows that flexibility is the #1 consideration for millennials when looking for a role. That's what the research always showed prior to the whole COVID situation, where a whole new bunch of people have experienced working from home for the first time. Based on what we can see from surveys that are being run right now, and what we're seeing through conversations on Twitter and so on, it's not just millennials that are seeking this anymore. Now that most people have tasted work from home, that's what people are looking for. So in this new world that we're living in now more than ever, as well as that flexibility, security and stability are hugely important to workers, and that's going to continue to be incredibly important over the next couple of years. So a successful employer brand, a successful recruitment brand needs to demonstrate that your workers will have flexibility around both when and where they do their work, and that you will provide a secure, stable employment for your team. I won't dwell on this for too long, but if hiring remotely and opening up to locationless, something you do need to bear in mind is that international employment is pretty complex. And if you are going to open up to recruiting outside of your HQ country, I'm guessing that most people on this call, their HQ country is Ireland, but there may be some of you where that's different. If you're opening up to other countries, you will want to consider each of the things that I've mentioned here on this slide. It may be that some countries will work for you as an employer, some are a lot more challenging. You'll need to have some familiarity with local employment terms. You'll need to produce locally compliant employment agreements. You'll need to understand the rules around termination before you employ people in a country, terminating people in other countries. Some countries, countries like Germany, the Netherlands, it is not straightforward. You need to have a partner that can help you with processing payroll and filing all of your taxes locally in that country. You'll need to process payroll in the country that the worker is tax resident in. And you'll need to consider the cost of employment in that country. So what are the employer taxes? What contributions do you need to make to social insurance or pensions or so on? They can be very, very different to Ireland or wherever your HQ country is. So bear all of that in mind. I'll give an email address at the end. If anyone has specific questions about any of that or about any specific countries, you can get in touch. Often people will look at having independent contractors as a workaround for this. For most countries, that's not compliant unless the person is working on a fixed term, very clearly defined project for you. If they're full-time ongoing worker, they probably need to be classified as an employee, and you need to take care of all of the things listed on this slide. So worth bearing in mind. In terms of remote work policies, probably the #1 or the key one that's going to be a major difference versus co-located is your work from home policy. And people often ask about remote work policies. All of the things that apply when people are co-located at an office do apply when people are working from home.
but you will want to have a work from home policy. And there aren't really specific guidelines around this right now for Ireland. There aren't for most countries, but a number of governments over the last few weeks have been drafting policies and putting measures in place. So it's probably likely that we'll get very specific regulations around this here as well. So it makes sense for you as a company to define your own policy, even if this isn't something that's required on a statutory basis. You'll want to be very clear around specific requirements and guidelines. So do you have requirements around people needing to have a very specific work from home setup? A lot of companies will have this. I strongly recommend it. You need to know that your people have a space to work that's free from distractions, where they will be comfortable and where they're well set up to work. Not everyone's home living situation is consistent with that. So I have heard of some companies specifying that if someone lives in a house share, for example, they need to have a dedicated workspace. They can't simply say, I'm going to work from the kitchen table. You know, if it's someone who lives with housemates, that's not always going to be practical, particularly someone in a sales role who has to do sales calls and so on. So set all of that out in a written policy so that there is no doubt about that. We'll talk about recruitment process in a moment, but I would advise that you ask about this during the recruitment phase. People can send photos of their homework setup or send you a video so that you're very, very clear on that. Working hours, really important. We'll talk a bit about people's working times and challenges that can pose in a minute. Set that out in your document, what you expect and when you expect people to be available. Health and safety guidelines for the office apply at home. So in Ireland, there is a requirement for all employers to ensure that their workers have a safe space to work that's of minimal risk. You as an employer need to ensure this for home workspace. And that requires making sure that there's a dedicated workspace that is ergonomically appropriate. And you should support your team with ensuring that they have the right kind of ergonomic setup. You can share videos with them. There are a number of services that will do online consultations. We're just about to sign up all of our workers for private consultations. So they'll do a one-to-one video call. Our workers are based all over Europe. It's an Irish company we're using, and they will advise and make sure that everyone's desk, monitors, chair, and so on are appropriate. It's really important that you have employer's liability insurance. Your home workers can be covered under your standard policy, but it's really worth checking that out with your insurer. And make sure that you have an employee handbook. This applies to employment in general. In Ireland, there are specific things you need to have shared with your employees around grievance policy. Check with your HR advisor around the policies that you have to provide to your workers and ensure that they're included in a handbook. There are things that you have to have. There are legal requirements around them. There are other things that you may choose to provide. I describe these as nice to have. Personally, I would say they're essential, but they're not a statutory requirement. So in your employee handbook for remote workers, have a section on how we work. What tools do you use? How do you communicate with each other? What are the expectations around response times? So for example, for our team, you know, we state that we all use Slack. We all stay in Slack throughout the day while we're working, because people are in different time zones and we sometimes work asynchronously. We don't expect people to have we actually expect people to not have their notifications turned on outside of working hours. So some of us may choose to work later from time to time. It's important that people aren't disturbed during their personal time off. So we default to please have your notifications turned off outside of your regular working hours. We default to Slack for communications. We use Coda for our documentation. All of this is set out in our How We Work document. We onboarded a new employee based in Macedonia last week, and someone like that joining the team has access to all of this information on their first day, and it really helps with that onboarding and helps them to understand our cultural norms as a company. Mental health and wellness support are hugely important. I'll talk a little bit about burnout in a moment, but during the current crisis, this has kind of really risen to the top of the priority list for a lot of people. I would advise that you proactively have supports in there for your workers. I could talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So disconnecting and time off, this is a really known challenge with remote teams. This is not specifically related to the current COVID crisis, but absolutely the current COVID crisis has again brought this to the surface. It's put a magnifying glass on this, and certainly people are suffering from burnout during the current situation. My own team, we're running a roundtable discussion today for heads of people ops at slightly larger remote first companies, and we're focusing on burnout as a topic to discuss. And all of the participants have said that burnout is currently an issue with their teams. Their teams are seasoned remote workers. They would each have a couple of hundred employees. They would often be employing people who have worked remotely for many years, but this is an issue. As an employer, it's your responsibility. I feel very, very strongly that it's your responsibility to ensure that your people are healthy and happy, and that the work environment that you provide enables them to be healthy, happy people. It's important to have policies and guidelines that ensure that overwork and this seeping of work time into private time doesn't become a challenge. And it's difficult to deal with these challenges and issues. But defining work hours is really important. I touched on that a moment ago, but make it very, very clear what hours people are expected to work, particularly if people are distributed across different time zones. Make it clear when people are expected to respond. In terms of time off, we are, with our own team, I've had a number of discussions around this. We found no one was taking time off. Most of our team had not taken any annual leave this year because people didn't take time off in January and February. And then suddenly we're all grounded. Nobody was going away on holidays. We have talked with our team about this. We ran a survey, asked how people wanted this to be handled. And what we've done is we've asked people to take a certain percentage of their paid time off before the end of June this year. So we have people I'm taking next week off myself. And we do feel that that's also important for management to lead on that and to demonstrate that it's okay to take time off. It's something that you really do need to check in on your team with. You have, in Ireland at least, you have a responsibility as an employer to make sure people use their annual leave allocation or the statutory allocation of 20 days. A sick leave policy is very important. There is no requirement in Ireland to provide statutory sick pay. We, certainly the types of customers that we work with generally would have some form of sick leave allowance. It's important to make that very, very clear to your workers, ensure it's outlined in their handbook so that they feel comfortable taking time off if they need to. And then guidance around disconnecting. I think I've already covered that in relation to people turning off notifications and understanding what are the expectations around response times. It's important to remember if you have workers somewhere like France, you are legally obliged to ensure that they don't receive communications outside of working hours. So it's an important responsibility to be aware of. And then I mentioned time zones. Asynchronous communications are I was about to say gold standard. They're actually the norm and the expectation for remote distributed teams, known as best practice. So for us, we would do a lot of our decision making and collaborative work using platforms like Coda and Google Docs. People can respond in their own time whenever works for them. If a couple of people are working on a documentation, we will also use videos. We'll use things like Loom to share instructional videos with each other. We record all of our team all hands, which we do via Zoom and always did prior to the COVID situation. And people can, if they're not available at the time of the meeting, if they're on holiday, they can check back in and watch that video at another time. Asynchronous communications are the best way to run a remote team, but it can mean that people have this constant drip feed of information coming into them. So make it clear how people should manage that, and that it is okay for them to disconnect when they should. So just before we move to Q&A, to just recap the topics I've covered there. Remote work and going locationless will allow you to recruit, hire, and retain the very best people. Always remember, talent is distributed. Once you open up your recruitment pool and spread that wider, you'll be amazed at the quality of people that you see. It's really important to develop a very considered employer brand and to make it clear that you are a remote recruiter. You will want to implement the right remote recruitment process. You will want to educate yourself on remote work and local employment regulations, and keep on top of any work from home policies that are implemented. Make sure that you implement best practice around remote work policies, and avoid burnout by facilitating time off and enabling people to really disconnect. So questions. So Laura, I'm not sure how we're handling this. I think you're going to run through some questions with me.
Yeah, so a few questions have been coming up in the Q&A box here, so we can start with them. So the first one is, do contracts need to change if a company is transitioning? Like if a company has a place of work in all contracts, does that need to change?
Very good question. There is a requirement in Ireland, the UK, in many countries that you include place of work on the contract. I see Tracy saying my sound is a bit choppy still. There is background noise. Let me close my window. There was a helicopter.
Yeah, I was going to say, I didn't think it was the sound that time, it was just the helicopter.
Yeah, the helicopter. Sorry about that. Yes, so there is a requirement to name a place of work. If you're recruiting someone who will work from home, you would name that as their place of work. If they're working ordinarily, people will have very different arrangements or plans coming out of our lockdown situation in terms of where their people will be. If you know that ordinarily people will be at your head office or a co-working space, you would name that on the contract, but your contract will always say, usually whoever is drafting your contract, your employment lawyer or HR advisor, will say that your contract should say your usual place of work will be, and you detail the address, and usually it will say, or any other place as required or requested by the company from time to time. So that's very commonly used in contracts because people like salespeople are out and about, or people travel for work, or some people may be going on secondments to customer locations. That it's allowed to have some flexibility in that place of work.
So with that, as say companies now might having people working from home now, and they decide actually maybe this working from home thing is a bit more for me, even if I was doing it 3 days a week or 2 days a week, is it best to kind of request that be changed in your contract, at least to add another address just so it's all written down, or is it fine to leave it?
So the requirement is that your employment agreement will detail your usual place of work. So ordinarily, if a company was changing its HQ or changing its office, it would send a side letter to the employee that would act as kind of an addendum to the employment agreement and would name the new office. But so long as the place of work listed on or detailed on the employment contract, so long as that is a place that this person will be fairly regularly, it's fine if they are also at some other location from time to time. You wouldn't have to detail that on the contract.
Yeah, perfect. Are there insurance implications if someone gets an injury at home?
This is a challenging one. Yes. During the hours that someone is working for you, their home, if they're working from home, is their place of work. You as an employer are obliged to ensure that they have a safe space to work from. This is really difficult. I suspect we're going to see some legislative changes. I personally haven't heard about anything being in the works in terms of legislation on this, but I think because work from home is getting it's going to be so common over the next few years, I expect we may see some greater clarification on this, because it's very difficult for an employer to control.
Mm-hmm.
So there are insurance implications. You need to have your employer's liability insurance. You should make sure that your employer's liability insurance covers people working from home. And then as a responsible employer, you should make sure that you've done check-ins with your workers to ensure that you understand their setup from home, and you give them guidance on how to have a safe workspace from home. So you should be advising them, and some of this stuff seems really obvious, but we all know how insurance works.
Mm-hmm.
You as an employer need to be advising the individual to make sure there are no trip hazards around where they work. This is another reason why it's really important to define working hours.
Yeah.
So if your worker is working for you for very defined hours, and then they have an accident later in the evening outside of working hours in their home, if they're not working at that time, then you as an employer should not be liable for what happens to them, when they late in the evening on a Saturday night, when they've had a few drinks and they trip and fall in their bathroom. They weren't working for you actively at the time. You shouldn't have liability. But as an employer, if you haven't clearly set out when that person is and isn't working, there can be some grey area there. So keep it very clear.
That must be hard in the regard of if you're flexible working, whereby you probably don't have like a certain 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, but as you said, if you clearly outline at least some of the hours that you're working, then that can help around that.
And the way we all work now is very different to so many people are not working 9 to 5 jobs. People don't clock off at the end of the day. So this stuff is, it's not black and white the way it was years ago, and legislation and insurance policy documents are trying to find the black and white in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some challenges, but it's just really, really important to make best endeavors and to allow for this as much as you can.
Yeah. Is Ireland well positioned in comparison with other countries for hiring remote workers?
I would say it is. There's still a huge amount of work to be done, and I'm always so impressed when I see all of the work that Grow Remote are doing. The government here, prior to the COVID situation, were listening, and they were on top of this, and they saw a really great opportunity, and that's in a large part thanks to the team at Grow Remote, and particularly Tracy. And I know many months ago she was in talking to the Oireachtas on this, and they really sat up and listened because of her very compelling arguments around why this was an exciting opportunity for Ireland. So for me, I was blown away, and it's such a huge indicator of the Irish government's proactive approach on this. I was blown away to hear that the IDA and Enterprise Ireland have people who are focused on remote work, and they're really have great targets and goals around supporting remote work roles in Ireland. Most countries are not there yet. We're a little bit ahead of the curve, I think. The US, the US telecommuting would have been the terminology. When you look at the data around the proportion of Americans that work from home all or some of the time, it is actually the majority of office workers. They're streets ahead of us, and it's very, very established, and research is very established in the space. But I think we as a country could really catch up, and the government support is there, and now that's all being very much accelerated because of what's happened over the last couple of months. So
which is really exciting. Yeah. Riona asks, how are people managing to combine working and childcare? It's so difficult.
I don't know if I have an answer on this one. I think with great difficulty. You know, I don't have kids myself, so it's not a problem that I've personally been experiencing. Our team, we have, I think, 3 people with children. It's not the majority of our team, but it has been difficult for them. It's difficult for everyone with children. I think as employers, you have to be understanding of this. You know, it's like I said, if you want really awesome people to do really awesome work for you, they have to be happy and healthy and sane. And in my mind, it doesn't work to say that people during their working hours have to pretend those children don't exist and have to block them out. I don't understand that philosophy on management. You know, people have children at home, and for an organization like ours, we have people working from home before this situation, so people would have children in their homes. I think if you're hiring, the current situation is not working from home as usual.
No,
you know, it's not remote work as usual. If you're hiring people, and when you're asking those questions at the recruitment phase around their living situation and their home office setup, it is relevant. If they have children that they're responsible for, small children during the day, you know, can they focus? They can't focus on work for a fixed number of hours. They will have to dip in and out. Some roles can really facilitate that, and some companies can really facilitate that. Some possibly can't. But in the current situation, employers have to be very, very flexible. I'd love to say I had some magic solution to this one. I don't. But,
no, and you're right.
Yeah.
As I said, this is a weird situation, but then at the same time, kids are home every summer as well. So employers always need to find out of what the living situation is, or that, because it's not as if once COVID goes away, everyone's kids are going to go away as well while you work from home. So
yeah, and I think this thing around flexible working, and that's why this thing of defining work hours is such a challenge. Flexible working is here to stay. There was a huge movement towards this before the COVID situation. It's enormously accelerated, and we've all had existential crises during this situation. Everyone has questioned how they live and how their lives work. And people don't want to go back to the manic situation they had before, where they were pushing their kids into the car in the morning and trying to get out to drop them off at childcare as early as possible and picking them up late in the evening when they're tired and hungry. People don't want to live like that. And employers are now faced with the reality that for the most part, or in many, many cases where employers had previously denied that work from home or flexibility could work, they're now faced with the reality that it often can work, and it can work really well. And there are definitely employers saying, I've been amazed, my team are actually more productive, more creative. This is something we want to lean into and do more of. And I think offering that flexibility and supporting parents is going to be part of that. We probably don't have the answers yet, but people will figure that out.
Absolutely. Renata says, great presentation, thank you. Do most companies pay employee utility bills and internet bills, or do they assume that it is included in the salary package?
So most of our customers will be remote first companies, or companies that very much support remote work. A lot of them will be kind of Silicon Valley tech companies where their employees are very, very well taken care of. You know, they'd be on often be San Francisco rated salaries and so on. So what we see pretty much across the board, or the vast majority of the time, is that people get a stipend. We pay a stipend to our own team, and that stipend, it's up to, we just pay a fixed sum every month. It's up to the employee how they use that. Our assumption is that it goes towards things like internet and utility. I should say that prior to the COVID situation, we paid for a co-working space for each of our workers, and when people would join us, we would talk to them about it and say, you know, our request and our hope is that you work from a co-working space most of the time. That was important to us to avoid people suffering from challenges with isolation. obviously the world is different now. All of our team are working from home and possibly will be for the foreseeable future. So we were previously paying a stipend. We have increased the sum of that stipend because we know they're working from home. We're currently looking at offering people a budget for home working set up for desks, chairs, and so on. So we think that will start to be something we offer as standard.
Very good. Any tips for hybrid teams versus fully remote in terms of culture or ways of working?
Yeah, I mean, research does show that hybrid teams, it's more challenging to make work than fully remote. That's not helpful if you're in that situation. I think it does mean you need to work a little harder. If everyone's co-located or if everyone's fully remote, everyone's playing by the same rules and guidance, and something that's an uncomfortable experience for one will be an uncomfortable experience for everyone. At a very high level, a really simple thing I would say is, if you have a hybrid team, for things like group meetings, everyone should join via video. It's not a comfortable experience if I'm joining via video and 5 or 6 of my colleagues are joining via video and we're all individuals on the Zoom call, and then everyone else is in a meeting room together. What you get in those situations is the people in the meeting room end up having side chats. They turn around and speak to each other, or people are mumbling and you can't hear, but it's difficult to interrupt and say that there's a problem with the audio. Once everyone's on Zoom, everyone's experience is the same. So we're a remote first company, but a number of us were working from the same co-working space in Dublin from when we started Boundless. And always from day one, our rule was everyone join. We all sit separately and everyone logs in separately to Zoom. If you're going to change one thing, make that the thing you change, and it is transformative. Your remote people will love you for it. There is a real cost from a culture perspective of not taking that approach.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. Where my team, a few of my team members are based in Bratislava, but exactly as you said, we'd go into the meeting room and just do your side conversations. Whereas over the last few weeks, now that we're all on video, I've gotten to know my colleagues in Bratislava and how funny they are, because we're all kind of engaging in that 5-minute banter as such before the meeting starts. So it's if there was definitely one thing, it would be that going forward, that we all still, to maintain that relationship as well that has been built up.
Yeah, really important. And then documentation as well, ensuring everything's documented. So if people who are co-located are having meetings, it has to be your company's, I would say this is just good practice for running companies. Things should be documented. Decisions shouldn't be made in silos. And open access to information is really important, so that there aren't decisions being made by the people co-located at the office and remoters just hear about it after the event. Really important to not have a 2-tier system. What can happen, we hear people use the terminology a lot, second-class citizens, when people have co-located HQ'd employees who are all compliantly employed, get all of the benefits, and then the international remote workers are contractors. They don't get benefits. And often companies will give it lip service and say, oh, we value you guys just as much as our co-located HQ employed workers. And people go, yeah, but we're not treated the same way. We don't get the same benefits. That can be it can be quite toxic from a culture perspective, and really important in terms of retention, to have those people feeling that they're being treated as well as your co-located workers.
Yeah. Thank you. We've loads more questions. Renata, would you recommend the employer sets up regular training, information sessions on safety working from home and requests employee to complete as part of their job requirement, presuming this would help mitigate risks and liability?
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. This is something more often in co-located environments. It's something you see at larger, more corporate employers, and you see it less with smaller companies. But it becomes more important when people are remote. So things like informational videos. There are companies that you can use that can do video calls with your team and talk them through what's required for the right ergonomic setup and for the right space. And yet requiring that this is done as part of onboarding, or requiring that it's done at regular intervals each quarter or every 6 months, that would absolutely mitigate risks and liability as an employer.
Renata has another great question on that as well. Would the liability only apply to the place they work in the home? Hard to understand how an accident in the kitchen or bathroom during work hours would be an employee liability.
I mean, I totally agree with you that it is very hard to understand. Ultimately, I think this will come down to the insurance policy that you have and your insurer. And I can't, insurance policies can vary so greatly. I can't really comment on that or clarify how that works. It's quite a specialist insurance situation, and it will be individual to each company, but very much worth looking into that with your insurer.
Given getting a job in the remote space is competitive, how can people stand out when applying for remote roles?
Really good question. As an employer, when hiring a remote employee, you are looking for slightly different things than or you might be looking for more things than you would for co-located hires. Having really strong written communication skills is the number one thing. I personally would never, ever, ever hire any remote worker, no matter how awesome they were in every other area. If they didn't have really great written communication skills, I would find it really hard to justify how we would hire that person. Clarity, brevity, hugely important. I'm not always great on the brevity, something I have to work very hard on. These are things, it's always very, very apparent during the recruitment process. You pick up on these things, but as someone applying for a job, every communication you have with that prospective employer, be really clear, be really succinct in each of your email communications when setting up interviews or discussing the role. On things like Zoom calls, follow the best practices. I always say joining a Zoom call without your camera on is like walking into a meeting room with a paper bag over your head. We all know that's not okay in the real world, and it's not okay in the virtual world. If I think at this stage we've all used Zoom, but it is hard to believe that 2 months ago, 3 months ago, you would do meetings with people who had never used Zoom before in their lives. If they're using a different platform that you haven't used before, test it out the day before the interview. Google a little instructional video on how it works. As an employer, if someone can't figure that out for themselves, you're like, this person's not a problem solver. Mm-hmm. They obviously struggle with using new software. Make sure you understand the tools that they're using. And documentation, like I would refer in your interviews, refer to how you document processes and how in the past you have communicated with teammates asynchronously using documents and other tools.
Brilliant advice, kind of those small things, yeah. Do you think there's a chance that if all companies go remote, they'll hire in countries with cheaper labour?
So this one is often raised as a question. I actually got involved in a Twitter conversation on this a few days ago. So when years ago, remote working was referred to as offshoring, and it was always done for cost reasons. And around the time I joined tech, so like about 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, offshoring was this thing that a lot of companies were doing, and they made decisions based on cost. And so many of those companies ended up bringing the work that was being done by these remote teams back in-house because it didn't work well. I mean, you hire cheap, you get cheap. Quality is quality. Great people. If you're hiring a really great software developer and they live in a country with a low-cost labor market or lower cost, like say India, for example, they're a great software developer. They can get a great job working for a great company in Silicon Valley. Why would they accept local salary rates. If their work is world class, if they're delivering world class work, once people work remotely, they can't hide behind they can't hide behind being kind of pushy or being a certain personality or always speaking up in the meetings. The quality of people's work is very, very apparent, and good people will always be able to get good jobs. So I think this one's a bit of a misnomer. I always say to people, don't go remote for cost reasons. It's actually, it can be expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Doing it properly is not cheap. It can be more expensive because you need to invest in certain areas. And I always say to people, assume it's going to cost you a bit more, but you will get so much more in return. Ultimately, your business will thrive. You will get the value back, but don't do it because it's cheap. It will likely bounce back. And this notion that ultimately we'll see all of these jobs going to cheaper countries, the technology has been there to support that for the last 7-8 years, and it hasn't happened.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's going to happen now.
Brilliant. Niamh McNally in the chat, and thoughts on managing up to encourage and help senior management to take their leave. Busy small company, lots of change afoot, and I can see the burnout setting in, but I fear the C execs will just power through and it will lead to disaster. Fully distributed company, by the way.
Yeah, this is, I mean, like I say, I'm doing a roundtable with 10 heads of people ops this afternoon on this very topic, because it's a really big problem. And I put my hand up and say, I've suffered from burnout a bit during this whole situation. We're all under a lot of stress. There's a lot of stress in the world, and we're all absorbing it. And we don't have our usual ways of blowing off steam. We're not going on nice holidays. We're not going out with a big group of friends on a Saturday night. We're not going to the theatre or the cinema. I've had to have a word with myself and take some time off and try and I find I'm working, I watch an hour of Netflix and I go to bed. It's really unhealthy. So first of all, I would say lead by example. Myself and my 2 co-founders had a big chat about this a few weeks ago, and we were saying, how are we going to get people to take time off? They're not taking time off. Are we going to have to enforce time off? What are we going to do? And then one of them stopped and said, guys, I need to point something out here. We're having this lengthy discussion about this. It's the irony that none of us have taken any time off recently. Does that occur to either of you? So we realized that we need to take time off as well. You do have to lead by example. It's all right. You're not on the leadership team.
I see that.
Yeah, I mean, I would talk to your leadership team about it very openly, and I would say to them, I'm worried about you. You need downtime. I bet they are feeling burnt out. If they haven't said it, I bet they are. It's really important. And like ultimately running businesses, whatever business you're in, it's always a marathon, not a sprint. And if you don't have your mental health, you don't have anything, so it has to be preserved and worked on.
Are you operating in Portugal now, and what you consider the best advantages to hire employees in Portugal?
So yes, we are operating in Portugal. So anyone interested in that can give me a shout. I'll share my screen with you at the very end with contact details. In terms of advantages of hiring people in Portugal, if you're employing through Boundless, the whole I suppose upside of working with Boundless is that as a customer, you have a fairly seamless experience. So for you, your people, wherever they are, there isn't a huge difference between your employment of people in Ireland or Portugal or Germany or wherever they may be. In terms of advantages, there is a big pool of very, very talented people there. There are a lot of really great software engineers. There are some great universities. It's also really good quality of life. People have been flocking to Portugal in the last couple of years. So particularly Lisbon, it's become a real hotspot for tech talent from all over the world to move to. It's a really cool place. It's got really good nightlife. It's got the beach. You'll find a lot of happy workers there for sure. And it's quite, you know, it's a good place to do business. So it's not too onerous in terms of, from an employer perspective, in terms of employing people and your legal obligations. But if you were employing people through Boundless, we would take care of all of those legal obligations and guide you on that. But it's not as challenging as some other European countries. So yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah. I know we're coming to the end now, so I'll just finish out on one last question. What tools do Boundless use internally? Notion, Slack, etc. I know you spoke about Slack earlier. Yeah,
good question. So we use Slack for our day-to-day comms. We generally always have Slack on, and we all live in Slack all day, every day. It's also where we have a lot of our banter and social conversations. We started using Coda about 4 or 5 months ago, and we love it.
Okay.
Coda's awesome. We started using it for internal documents, where once decisions were made, it's where things would go. Where we have documents that we all might need to refer back to. Our business, you know, we have a lot of documentation relating to each country that we employ people in. So, and when I say employ people in, I mean on our customers' behalf. So that employment is core to our business. So we have a lot of country-specific information. We have documents we have to refer to. So that's where they all live. More recently, we started using it for documents we share externally. So information packs that we put together for customers or even for investors. We share Coda pages. Everything just looks really cool. It's really easy to use. My co-founder Eamon always says it's like using Lego and Play-Doh. It's like, I think he describes it as like Google Docs, but with Lego and Play-Doh. So it's just all these building blocks you put together and everything looks great. We tried using Twist. Other members of the team are bigger fans than I am. I think maybe I don't use it properly. Twist we use for decision making specifically. And then once the decisions are made, they go into Coda. They're the key things. I think we Google Docs. We use Google Docs far less now that we're using Coda, but we would use Google Sheets because we do a lot of calculations, like the net pay calculations and things like that.
Yeah. Brilliant. Dee, we've come to the end now, so I just want to thank you so much again. Do you want to pop up your contact details there that you were saying?
Yeah, let me do that.
And thank you everyone for joining and all the great questions. We are completely voluntary, so this has been fantastic, absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, no problem at all. My details are up there. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. That's my Twitter handle. And feel free to pop me an email. If any of you have any questions at all about international employment, country-specific questions about employment regulations, anything about international payroll, you can always email ask@boundlesshq.com. And the team will answer your question. We have experts in-house on international payroll and HR compliance. So you should always feel free to contact us anytime.